The galaxy where this story unfolds does not begin in chaos. It begins in repetition. Familiar songs loop through empty corridors of space. Old melodies drift across alien landscapes that were never meant to carry them. The world appears expansive, colorful, unruly, yet its emotional center is anchored to a very small, very specific past. Before conflict announces itself, before alliances fracture and loyalties are tested, there is a man walking forward while looking backward, carrying a private archive of memories as if they were provisions for survival. Star-Lord emerges not first as a hero, nor even as an outlaw, but as a cultural residue. He is an artifact in motion. His presence feels slightly misaligned with the world around him, as though he arrived a few decades late, or left too early and never adjusted to the new climate. His jokes, his music, his references operate like echoes bouncing inside a larger arena that no longer responds the way it once did. The galaxy accepts him, tolerates him, sometimes celebrates him, but it does not mirror him. That distance matters. It is not comic. It is structural. This universe runs on expansion. Empires rise, collapse, reassemble under new banners. Power migrates. Identities are forged under pressure, rather than preserved through sentiment. Survival favors adaptation, not remembrance. Yet at the center of this moving system stands someone who refuses to let go of a fixed internal geography. Star-Lord carries Earth not as origin, but as territory occupied. It defines his rhythm, his language, his posture toward danger and intimacy. The conflict is already present here, embedded quietly in the foundation. A man whose sense of self is rooted in a time that cannot be revisited, navigating a world that only moves forward. Nostalgia in this space is not a feeling. It is a strategy. It stabilizes him. It offers coherence where the universe provides none. His mixtapes are not accessories or quirks. They are borders. They mark where his identity begins and where the outside world is held at bay. Each song becomes a portable room, a memory with walls thick enough to resist the pressure of loss, exile, and moral ambiguity. Before he ever draws a weapon or makes a choice that carries consequence, he has already chosen memory over transformation. The galaxy reads him accordingly. Others see bravado, humor, recklessness. They interpret the surface. What remains unseen, at least initially, is how tightly his persona is fastened to a frozen emotional moment. A child taken too soon. A goodbye that was never metabolized. A loss that did not evolve into mourning, but into preservation. His identity does not mourn the past. It embalms it. That distinction defines everything that follows. Around him, systems operate with ruthless clarity. Authority expresses itself through force, hierarchy, conquest. Belonging is transactional. Trust is provisional. The guardians form not because of shared values, but because necessity compresses them into proximity. This is a universe where alliances are temporary shelters, not homes. Star-Lord steps into this environment with an internal script already written, one that frames connection through humor, loyalty through pop references, and leadership through improvisation rather than authority. It works, until it does not. The tension does not announce itself as danger. It appears first as charm. Nostalgia makes him legible. It humanizes him in a landscape dominated by extremity. His refusal to let go of Earth culture functions as resistance against becoming fully absorbed by the galaxy's logic. There is something admirable here, a refusal to harden, a refusal to become purely instrumental. Yet embedded in that refusal is a rigidity that has not yet been tested. Memory can protect. It can also immobilize. The arena expands. The stakes escalate. Threats begin to exceed the scale of personal survival. The galaxy does not ask who he was. It demands who he is willing to become. And here, the system begins to strain. Nostalgia, once a stabilizing center, starts to behave like gravity. It pulls him back toward a version of himself that no longer fits the size of the conflict unfolding. The world does not stop to accommodate this tension. It applies pressure. Star-Lord continues to perform confidence. He occupies the spotlight with practiced ease. Humor diffuses fear. Music punctuates moments that might otherwise require silence. Yet beneath this performance lies an unresolved contradiction. Leadership demands sacrifice of old reference points. It demands the ability to let meaning evolve. Nostalgia resists this evolution. It insists that the past remain untouched, unchallenged, authoritative. The system has not yet collapsed, but the fracture is visible to anyone watching closely. This story does not begin with a villain or a battle. It begins with a man carrying a memory too carefully. A universe that moves by erasure and reinvention encounters someone who refuses both. The conflict is already alive, circulating beneath the surface. It does not need to be introduced. It needs only time, pressure, and consequence to reveal itself. Star-Lord enters the narrative already fractured, though the fracture is not immediately legible as damage. It presents itself as style. His gestures, references, and emotional timing are calibrated to a world that no longer exists. This is not simple displacement. It is a refusal to complete a developmental passage that would require surrendering the authority of memory. His identity does not originate in the galaxy he inhabits. It remains anchored to a moment before loss demanded adaptation. The origin point matters because it determines how meaning is generated, how loyalty is interpreted, and how power is understood. The universe that surrounds him is not sentimental. It rewards flexibility and punishes fixation. Identity here is forged through survival, not remembrance. Characters who thrive within it accept mutation as necessity. They abandon origins easily, treating past affiliations as temporary scaffolding rather than permanent architecture. In contrast, Star-Lord treats his origin as a fixed center. Earth is not a background. It is the lens through which all experiences are filtered. His humor relies on reference. His authority relies on familiarity. His leadership style mirrors cultural scripts learned before he ever understood the cost of loss. This attachment is not simply emotional. It is structural. Nostalgia functions as a stabilizing mechanism that compensates for unresolved grief. The child who lost his mother did not process absence through integration. He preserved her world intact. Music becomes ritual. Language becomes reenactment. Every callback to Earth culture reinforces the illusion that continuity was never broken. This illusion is functional. It allows him to move forward without confronting the implications of abandonment, mortality, and responsibility. But it also arrests development. Identity becomes maintenance rather than growth. Around him, other figures embody alternative responses to trauma and displacement. Some harden, some externalize control, some dissolve the self into collective purpose. These responses differ, but they share a common trait. They adapt. Star-Lord does not. He compensates. His persona absorbs pressure that would otherwise force transformation. Humor deflects intimacy. Improvisation replaces strategy. Confidence substitutes for authority. This is effective in a limited arena. It creates cohesion. It generates loyalty. But it does not scale indefinitely. The narrative world reinforces this tension subtly. Authority figures operate through domination and structure. They embody clarity of purpose even when that purpose is destructive. They know what they want. Star-Lord knows what he remembers. This difference defines the early asymmetry of power. His resistance to domination is not ideological. It is nostalgic. He resists becoming like them not because he has articulated an alternative ethic, but because doing so would require relinquishing the emotional shelter of his past. Memory functions as a boundary. It keeps the galaxy at a manageable distance. This boundary also shapes how others perceive him. He is readable. His references create accessibility. His emotional reactions follow patterns that feel familiar even in an alien context. This grants him social gravity. Others orbit him not because he commands authority, but because he offers coherence. In a fragmented environment, coherence attracts. Yet coherence built on nostalgia is brittle. It relies on repetition rather than resilience. It assumes the past can continue to authorize the present without revision. The guardians form within this field of tension. They are not united by shared history or ideology. They are compressed together by circumstance. Each carries their own fracture, their own response to displacement. What binds them initially is not vision, but survival. Star-Lord's role within this assembly is catalytic rather than directive. He creates momentum. He keeps movement alive. He fills silence with noise. This prevents collapse, but it also prevents reckoning. The group functions, but it does not yet integrate. The psychological foundation of the conflict lies here. Star-Lord's identity depends on remaining emotionally younger than the responsibilities placed upon him. Leadership threatens this equilibrium. Leadership demands the capacity to absorb loss without retreating into reference. It demands decisions that cannot be softened by humor or framed as performance. His internal economy resists this demand. Nostalgia insists that the self remain protected from irreversible change. This insistence does not announce itself as fear. It presents as charm. The narrative world does not challenge this immediately. Early successes reinforce his strategy. Improvisation works. Emotional deflection preserves group cohesion. Music punctuates moments of danger, transforming threat into spectacle. These victories validate the structure of his identity. They teach him that preservation is viable, that the past can continue to function as compass. This is the quiet danger. When avoidance is rewarded, it solidifies. Yet the universe is not static. Threats evolve. Stakes escalate. Loss becomes unavoidable. The systems of power that govern this world do not operate on memory. They operate on force, ambition, and expansion. As these systems press inward, the limitations of nostalgia become more pronounced. What once offered grounding begins to distort perception. Decisions are delayed. Consequences are misjudged. Emotional reactions lag behind reality. Star-Lord's foundational conflict is not between good and evil. It is between continuity and growth. He has mistaken preservation for integrity. In doing so, he has outsourced his sense of self to a frozen archive. The galaxy reads this as eccentricity, as relatability. But beneath that reading lies an unresolved question. What happens when the past can no longer authorize the present? What happens when memory becomes insufficient currency in a world that demands transformation? This question remains unanswered at this stage of the narrative. It does not yet demand confrontation, but it structures every interaction. Every joke delays it. Every song reinforces it. Every moment of success achieved without change deepens the eventual cost. The psychological foundations are set. The system is in motion. The conflict has not yet taken shape, but the conditions for its emergence are fully established. The conflict begins to take shape not through a singular rupture, but through accumulation. The galaxy expands its demands gradually, as systems of power tend to do. Threats stop being local. Consequences stop being reversible. Decisions start to echo beyond the immediate moment. Star-Lord remains at the center of the action, still improvising, still deflecting, still performing confidence as if momentum itself were a substitute for direction. What changes is not his behavior, but the environment's tolerance for it. Early confrontations reward speed and wit. Reaction outpaces reflection. Star-Lord thrives here. He navigates danger through movement, not planning. His leadership is kinetic. He keeps the group in motion, preventing paralysis. In these moments, nostalgia feels like fuel. It sharpens timing. It provides rhythm. The mixtape becomes a metronome for action, synchronizing chaos into something survivable. The audience reads this as competence. The narrative frames it as success. The system appears stable. Yet beneath the spectacle, pressure begins to concentrate. Opposing forces are no longer merely obstacles. They represent organized will. They are structured, hierarchical, expansive. They do not improvise. They execute. Their clarity exposes a contrast. Star-Lord reacts. They advance. This asymmetry does not immediately translate into defeat, but it introduces delay. Reaction creates gaps. Improvisation leaves residues. Each narrowly avoided collapse reinforces the belief that escape is sustainable. This belief becomes dangerous. The group dynamic shifts subtly. Survival evolves into responsibility. Protecting one another becomes more than instinct. It becomes expectation. Star-Lord's role within this shift remains ambiguous. He is still central, but the center is widening. Others begin to exhibit forms of authority grounded in conviction rather than charisma. Their responses to threat are less performative, more absolute. They accept loss as cost. Star-Lord resists this acceptance. His humor grows sharper, his references more frequent. Nostalgia begins to operate defensively. This is where the conflict sharpens. Leadership demands containment of fear, not its deflection. It demands decisions that cannot be reframed after the fact. Star-Lord continues to postpone this transition. He treats command as an extension of personality rather than a structural role. The galaxy responds by escalating stakes. What was once manageable through wit now requires sacrifice. The gap between his self-image and his function begins to widen. Key moments force choice. Not dramatic confrontations, but structural ones. Whom to protect? What to abandon? Which risks are acceptable? Star-Lord hesitates, not because he lacks courage, but because committing would collapse the illusion that he can remain unchanged. Nostalgia whispers that everything can still be fixed. That loss can be avoided. That retreat into humor will reset the board. The universe disagrees. It keeps moving. The audience begins to sense this friction. The charm persists, but its efficacy falters. Jokes land softer. Musical cues feel slightly out of place. The tonal mismatch becomes visible. The narrative no longer treats nostalgia as neutral texture. It frames it as weight. Each reference to the past delays adaptation by a fraction. Over time, these fractions accumulate into consequence. The first real cost emerges not as defeat, but as miscalculation. A choice made too late. A reaction framed as defiance rather than strategy. Star-Lord's reliance on personal codes rooted in memory clashes with systems that operate without sentiment. The result is not immediate collapse, but erosion of authority. Others begin to compensate around him. Decisions are made despite him rather than through him. Leadership decentralizes. This decentralization is subtle but decisive. It challenges his identity more than any external threat. Star-Lord has defined himself as the emotional center, the connective tissue holding disparate elements together. As others adapt independently, his role destabilizes. Nostalgia, once his anchor, now isolates him. It keeps him oriented toward a past that no longer organizes the group's present needs. The narrative does not punish him overtly. It allows him to continue functioning. This is more unsettling. The system absorbs his limitations temporarily, but at increasing cost. Each success achieved without adaptation tightens the eventual reckoning. The audience watches a familiar pattern. The refusal to outgrow an identity does not shatter it immediately. It hollows it out. By the end of this stage, the conflict has taken shape. It is no longer latent. Star-Lord stands at a crossroads without recognizing it as such. He believes continuity is strength. The galaxy has begun to test that belief. The tension is no longer invisible. It structures every engagement. What remains uncertain is whether preservation will finally give way to transformation, or whether nostalgia will continue to dictate his response until the system breaks. The second phase of the conflict unfolds when loss stops being abstract. Until this point, danger could still be framed as spectacle. Risk could be metabolized through motion, sound, and shared adrenaline. Now consequence acquires weight. The universe begins to exact payment in forms that cannot be reversed or reframed. Death is no longer a looming possibility. It becomes an active presence, shaping decisions before they are made. Star-Lord's reliance on nostalgia does not vanish under this pressure. It intensifies. Faced with irreversible stakes, his instinct is not recalibration but reinforcement. The past becomes louder. References multiply. Music surfaces at moments that demand silence. Humor sharpens into provocation. This is not denial in the crude sense. It is escalation. Nostalgia shifts from shelter to armor. It is no longer about comfort. It is about resisting collapse of the self-image that has kept him intact. The more the world demands transformation, the more fiercely he protects continuity. Opposing forces sense this rigidity. Systems of power do not need to understand nostalgia to exploit it. They recognize hesitation. They detect detachment. Where Star-Lord hesitates to sacrifice, they advance. Where he improvises, they commit. This dynamic creates a new polarity. It is no longer simply hero versus threat. It is fluidity versus fixation, adaptation versus preservation. The galaxy begins to punish sentimentality not out of malice, but because sentimentality cannot keep pace with expansion. Within the group, fractures surface. Trust remains, but alignment weakens. Others begin to experience his leadership as unpredictable rather than liberating. Decisions that once felt inspired now feel reactive. The emotional center he provided starts to distort collective judgment. Nostalgia does not just anchor him. It pulls others off course. They compensate by limiting his influence, consciously or not. This shift is quiet, but it marks a turning point. The narrative presents a moment where choice becomes unavoidable. A confrontation that cannot be danced around. A loss that cannot be undone. Star-Lord faces a decision that threatens the core of his preserved identity. To act decisively would require accepting that the past cannot authorize the present. That the child who survived through memory must give way to an adult who survives through responsibility. He resists, not out of cruelty, out of fear of annihilation. This resistance produces catastrophe, not random, not imposed from outside. It emerges logically from delay and miscalculation. The cost is personal. It strikes at the emotional center he has guarded most fiercely. For the first time, nostalgia does not protect him. It exposes him. The past he clung to offers no guidance here. Music falls silent. References fail. Humor collapses under the weight of consequence. The audience witnesses the collapse of a strategy. Not the collapse of the character, but of the mechanism that sustained him. Nostalgia reveals its limit. It cannot metabolize new trauma. It can only preserve old ones. Faced with fresh loss, Star-Lord confronts an emotional territory his identity was never built to navigate. The galaxy does not pause. It does not console. It moves on, indifferent to his internal rupture. In response, his behavior destabilizes. Where he once deflected, he now reacts. Emotion breaks through performance. Decisions become impulsive rather than improvised. This is not growth. It is regression under pressure. The difference matters. Adaptation requires integration. Regression reasserts earlier patterns more forcefully. Star-Lord lashes out not because he has changed, but because his old defenses have failed. This breakdown reshapes perception. Both within the narrative world and for the audience, his charm acquires a shadow. Nostalgia is no longer endearing. It is dangerous. It distorts judgment. It overrides collective need. The system reveals its verdict without declaring it. Preservation of identity has become incompatible with leadership. The past has turned from compass to obstacle. By the end of this stage, polarization is complete. Star-Lord stands divided between two irreconcilable demands: to remain who he was, or to become who the situation requires. The galaxy does not negotiate this demand. It enforces it through consequence. Nostalgia has reached its breaking point. What remains unresolved is whether it will finally be relinquished, or whether it will harden into something more destructive as the pressure continues to rise. After the rupture, the system reorganizes itself around damage rather than momentum. The galaxy does not register grief as a pause. It registers it as vulnerability. Star-Lord is still moving, still speaking, still occupying space, but the internal architecture that once supported those movements has collapsed. Nostalgia no longer functions as shelter or armor. It becomes residue. It lingers without purpose, coloring perception without providing direction. This is the most dangerous phase of the conflict, because it masquerades as clarity. Stripped of the illusion that the past can guide the present, Star-Lord does not immediately adapt. He doubles down on agency. Emotion, once diffused through humor, now seeks direct expression. Action replaces reflection. Where hesitation once delayed consequence, now impulsivity accelerates it. The narrative frames this shift not as empowerment, but as destabilization. Leadership without integration becomes volatility. Authority without inner coherence becomes noise. Opposing forces exploit this instability. They do not need to overpower him. They let him act. They allow his reactions to overextend. Each impulsive move creates collateral. Each emotional decision narrows options. The galaxy applies pressure by granting him room to fail. This is not cruelty. It is systemic logic. Structures collapse most efficiently when internal contradictions are allowed to play out unchecked. Within the group, alignment fractures fully. Loyalty remains, but it is no longer orienting. Others step into roles of containment, strategy, and restraint. Star-Lord's presence becomes centrifugal rather than unifying. He pulls attention toward unresolved emotion rather than collective purpose. This inversion marks the culmination of the polarization. Nostalgia has shifted from identity to interference. What once gave him coherence now disrupts the system he helped create. A critical confrontation arrives, not as spectacle, but as inevitability. The choice is no longer about saving someone or winning a battle. It is about relinquishing authorship of the narrative. To continue acting from nostalgia would mean imposing his unresolved past onto a future that cannot carry it. To step back would mean acknowledging that the version of himself sustained by memory is no longer fit to lead. This is not redemption. It is recognition. The narrative does not offer him triumph. It offers him containment. His agency contracts. His role narrows. He remains present, but no longer central. This demotion is not punishment. It is correction. The system recalibrates around more adaptive forms of leadership. Star-Lord's identity, once amplified by the spotlight, recedes into the background. The echo of Earth culture persists, but it no longer organizes the rhythm of events. For the audience, this shift reframes earlier moments. Nostalgia is recontextualized. What once appeared as resilience is revealed as postponement. What felt like authenticity is exposed as fixation. The charm was real, but it was incomplete. The myth of the eternal outsider dissolves. In its place stands a figure marked by unresolved continuity, unable to fully integrate into either world. This stage concludes not with resolution, but with displacement. Star-Lord is not transformed. He is disintegrated. The conflict does not destroy him. It renders him incomplete. Nostalgia remains, but it no longer masquerades as identity. It becomes memory without authority. The galaxy moves on, reorganized around forces that accepted mutation as necessity. The cost of refusing that necessity is now fully visible. What follows is not healing. It is aftermath. The system has revealed its logic. Identity that cannot evolve becomes friction. Memory that cannot be integrated becomes obstruction. Star-Lord survives, but survival is no longer synonymous with coherence. The narrative prepares to widen its lens. The conflict is no longer only his. It has become cultural. At this stage, the conflict detaches itself from Star-Lord as an individual case and expands outward into a cultural pattern. What began as a personal strategy for survival reveals itself as a familiar structure within modern myth-making. Nostalgia ceases to function merely as character texture and becomes the organizing principle through which audiences interpret him. The figure of Star-Lord no longer belongs exclusively to the narrative world. He becomes a symbolic surface onto which collective longings, anxieties, and unresolved attachments are projected. The galaxy he inhabits operates as a metaphorical environment shaped by acceleration, displacement, and constant reinvention. It mirrors a cultural landscape where identity is no longer inherited intact but assembled under pressure. In such environments, nostalgia acquires disproportionate power. It promises continuity where none is guaranteed. It offers emotional anchoring in systems that no longer provide stable centers. Star-Lord embodies this promise visibly. His refusal to let go of Earth culture reads as resistance to erasure. For audiences, this resistance feels human. Familiar songs, outdated references, and emotional immediacy function as access points into an otherwise alien world. This accessibility is crucial. It explains why nostalgia initially feels virtuous. It frames Star-Lord as relatable amid cosmic abstraction. He brings scale down to human proportion. Yet the narrative gradually exposes the cost of this translation. Nostalgia does not merely humanize the galaxy. It distorts it. It filters complexity through a narrow emotional aperture. The audience is invited to laugh, to recognize themselves, to feel at home. But this comfort comes at the expense of adaptation. The myth reveals its second layer only after identification has already taken place. Culturally, Star-Lord represents a figure trapped between epochs. He carries late 20th century cultural artifacts into a narrative space defined by post-historical conditions. His identity is assembled from remnants rather than futures. This positions him as a liminal figure, neither fully integrated nor fully displaced. The audience recognizes this condition intuitively. It mirrors a broader cultural experience of living among rapid technological, social, and ideological shifts while clinging to earlier frameworks of meaning. Nostalgia becomes the currency of stability in a world that no longer guarantees it. The narrative exploits this resonance deliberately. It allows nostalgia to function as connective tissue between audience and myth. But as the conflict escalates, that same tissue tightens. The story reveals how reliance on past meaning structures can undermine present responsibility. Star-Lord's failures are not framed as moral deficiencies. They are framed as structural consequences. He does not fail because he lacks virtue. He fails because his identity model is outdated relative to the scale of the problems he faces. This reframing is culturally significant. It challenges the romanticization of nostalgia as harmless sentiment. Instead, it positions nostalgia as a political and psychological force capable of shaping collective behavior. Within the narrative world, Star-Lord's attachment delays decisive action. In the cultural mirror, this attachment reflects how societies postpone necessary transformation by appealing to idealized pasts. The galaxy becomes an arena where these dynamics are rendered visible without being named. The Guardians themselves function as a microcosm of collective identity formation. Each member embodies a different response to displacement and trauma. What unites them initially is not shared memory, but shared necessity. Star-Lord's nostalgic leadership provides cohesion early on, but it cannot sustain collective evolution. As the group matures, nostalgia becomes a limiting factor. The narrative suggests that collective identity cannot be organized around preservation alone. It requires integration, sacrifice, and forward-oriented meaning. The audience's relationship to Star-Lord evolves in parallel. Early identification gives way to ambivalence. Charm no longer absolves failure. Humor no longer neutralizes consequence. This shift is uncomfortable by design. It forces the audience to confront their own investments in nostalgic narratives. The myth asks a difficult question without articulating it directly. At what point does familiarity become avoidance? When does remembrance begin to obstruct responsibility? Media itself plays a role in amplifying this tension. Star-Lord's mixtape is not just an object within the story. It is a commentary on how media circulates identity. Songs become emotional shortcuts. They bypass reflection and deliver immediate effect. In doing so, they stabilize the self temporarily. The narrative exposes both the power and the danger of this mechanism. Media does not simply reflect identity. It freezes it. It loops meaning. It prevents decay, but also prevents growth. This dynamic extends beyond the character. The franchise itself operates within a nostalgic economy. It draws on past cultural artifacts to generate emotional engagement. Star-Lord becomes the embodiment of this strategy within the story, making the critique reflexive. The myth comments on its own construction. Nostalgia sells coherence, but it also limits narrative evolution. The tension between innovation and preservation is not resolved. It is staged. Symbolically, Star-Lord's arc transforms him into a figure of arrested development on a cultural scale. He represents the danger of confusing emotional continuity with ethical consistency. The galaxy does not reject him because he remembers. It marginalizes him because he cannot translate memory into adaptive action. This distinction matters. The narrative does not advocate erasure of the past. It critiques the refusal to metabolize it. By externalizing this conflict into cosmic terms, the story allows audiences to observe it without defensiveness. The arena is distant enough to feel safe, yet familiar enough to resonate. Power structures, expansionist threats, and collective crises echo real-world conditions without requiring explicit allegory. Star-Lord stands at the center of this echo as a cautionary figure. Not a villain, not a hero undone, but a reminder that identity anchored exclusively in what will struggle to operate where what is demands transformation. The cultural impact of this portrayal lies in its refusal to offer comfort. Nostalgia remains seductive. It remains emotionally potent. But it is no longer innocent. The myth reframes it as a force that must be negotiated, not indulged. Star-Lord survives the narrative, but his authority does not. His relevance shifts. He becomes a symbol of a transitional moment rather than a stable ideal. In doing so, the story preserves him as myth while stripping him of dominance. The conflict has fully exceeded the individual. It now operates as a cultural lens. Nostalgia as identity is revealed as a temporary architecture. It can support meaning for a time, but under sustained pressure, it fractures. What remains is not emptiness, but the demand for a different foundation. The narrative does not build that foundation for the audience. It leaves the question open, embedded in the aftermath. What remains after the conflict settles is not resolution, but sediment. Star-Lord is still alive within the narrative, still present, still recognizable, yet no longer central in the way he once was. His legacy does not crystallize as triumph or failure. It crystallizes as limitation. He becomes a figure defined less by what he achieved than by what he could not relinquish. Nostalgia survives him as a trace, not as a guiding force, lingering like an old signal that still echoes even after its source has moved on. The system that once revolved around his charisma reorganizes itself with quiet efficiency. Leadership migrates toward structures capable of absorbing loss without collapsing inward. Decision-making becomes slower, heavier, less performative. The galaxy does not mourn the loss of Star-Lord's centrality. It adapts. This adaptation is the final verdict delivered without judgment. Systems that endure do so by privileging coherence over charm, integration over reference. Star-Lord's displacement is not punitive. It is structural. His identity remains intact, but its scope contracts. He no longer functions as a symbolic center through which meaning is routed. Instead, he becomes a peripheral figure whose presence carries historical weight without present authority. This is a subtle fate. It does not destroy the self. It renders it archival. Star-Lord transitions from protagonist to artifact, from active node to remembered configuration. His nostalgia, once generative, becomes descriptive. It tells a story about where he came from, not where things are going. For the audience, this aftermath reframes the entire arc retroactively. The early charm now reads as prelude rather than essence. The humor becomes signal rather than solution. Nostalgia reveals itself as a developmental pause extended too long. The myth does not condemn this pause. It contextualizes it. In a universe defined by rupture and acceleration, the impulse to preserve is understandable. But understanding does not equal endorsement. The story's clarity lies in distinguishing empathy from authorization. Star-Lord's legacy operates as a psychological warning embedded in popular myth. He embodies the cost of mistaking emotional continuity for maturity. His failure is not moral. It is temporal. He lives according to a clock that stopped at the moment of loss. Everything after that moment is filtered through preservation rather than integration. The galaxy, operating on a different temporal logic, eventually renders this mode of being obsolete. Yet the narrative refuses erasure. Star-Lord is not written out. He remains visible. His music still plays. His references still surface. The past is not destroyed. It is demoted. Memory persists without command. This is the final symbolic gesture. The story does not advocate forgetting. It insists on hierarchy. Memory must serve adaptation, not replace it. Culturally, this legacy resonates beyond the character. Star-Lord becomes emblematic of a broader condition within contemporary identity. A generation raised on inherited meanings, navigating environments that no longer support them. Nostalgia offers coherence, but at the cost of responsiveness. The myth captures this tension without resolving it. It leaves Star-Lord suspended between relevance and redundancy, familiar yet diminished. His story settles into the collective imagination as a transitional myth. He is not the model for what comes next. He is the record of what could not continue. The galaxy moves forward carrying his imprint without being governed by it. This is how myths age. They do not disappear. They lose centrality. They become reference points rather than destinations. In the end, Star-Lord's greatest significance lies not in his victories, nor in his losses, but in his refusal to outgrow the emotional architecture that once saved him. Nostalgia kept him alive. It also kept him incomplete. The narrative does not resolve this contradiction. It preserves it as clarity. Identity anchored in what was will always struggle to govern what must become. The conflict does not close. It stabilizes. It remains active wherever memory is mistaken for direction, wherever familiarity is allowed to substitute for responsibility. Star-Lord endures as a reminder etched into modern myth. Nostalgia can sustain a self through crisis. It cannot carry it indefinitely.